Most people have seen the movie Gladiator. In the movie, there is a very famous warrior that's forced to be a slave and later on turns into a gladiator. And in this movie, you see the terrible life of a Roman slave. But if you want to compare his life to an actual Roman slave, that's where you're wrong. Because an actual slave had a much worse life. We want to go to ancient Rome and see how a slave lived back then. The slaves we hear about today are usually African slaves in America that worked in the 18th century in cotton fields. And their job was specific about one thing, like you're supposed to pick cotton, pick sugar canes, and other things. But in ancient Rome, you didn't have a specific job as a slave. You were told what to do that day, and it could be different from the other days. It could be from cleaning, carrying heavy stuff, mining, or any other brutal job. They wouldn't stay in one section either. They could be sent everywhere else in the empire. And that's not with a bus where you can just get a ticket and go. They would get something ready that was extremely heavy for you to take from point A to point B and tell the slave to carry it all the way there so you don't go empty-handed. So who were these slaves? They weren't a specific group of people. There were just people in the lower class from all over the empire. There was always a chance for a normal person or a citizen of the Roman Empire to turn into a slave. Maybe you got into a fight with someone you didn't have to, someone much more powerful than you, and then they enslave you. There was always a chance for slaves to be prisoners of war from other parts of the empire, because some parts would revolt against the capital and try to overthrow it, and then they would get enslaved. If someone couldn't pay their debt, there's a chance they could get slaved by the person they owed money to. And depending on how much they owed the person, they were supposed to be slaving around for them. Like when a Roman wanted to buy a piece of land and they didn't have money, they could go speak with the owner and be enslaved by the landowner. And they could make a deal on how long you need to be his slave to get this section of the land. Maybe they would say 3 years or even more or less. We don't know, but that's how it worked. The slave would work for about 3 years, and then when his job was finished, he would get that piece of land. We are telling you this, but you can't compare a slave to a normal employee. These weren't treated like human beings. They would work every day, endless hours. They would barely get any sleep, any food, and they were treated extremely poorly. And sometimes they would even be killed if they disrespected the owner. A slave was a property of the owner rather than an employee. The worst thing is for a master to not like his slave, because there's a chance for a public execution. And to send a message to other slaves, they would even put them on the cross and crucify them. What would slaves eat anyways? They would eat two things. They would get grains so they can make their own breads and eat it. And for drink, they would get wine, because wine was cheaper than fresh water. It's interesting to know that freshwater sources at this time were all contaminated, and the people knew this, so they wouldn't drink it unless they were sure they're out of the populated city. So at this point, they were more comfortable giving them wine rather than water. Like for example, slaves that worked in fruit farms could have taken a piece of fruit and ate it if they felt like it. But if their masters saw it, it could be the end of them. So they had to be extremely careful. Everybody knows the warrior slaves in the Roman Empire, which are called gladiators, which we mentioned in the beginning. The gladiators would go to the stadium and put on a show for the wealthy and the emperor, and if they got killed, it didn't matter. Where did slaves stay at and live at? Anywhere a slave worked, they would have a house to live in, but it wasn't really a house, it was more like a prison on the property they worked at. They were forced in there at night to sleep, but they weren't free, so they couldn't just leave freely. And some of these buildings still remain to this day. But the slaves that worked inside the house of the wealthy people, they were more trusted, so they could live with their master. Something that pointed out slaves was their clothing, because they really had none of it. They just had white robes that they would put as a t-shirt and underwear, nothing else. And this would work for men and women. And in the winter, most of them had no warm clothing. It's interesting to note that in the Roman Senate, some of the senators felt bad for the slaves and the people, and they would say, we need to find out the population of the slaves in the empire. But none of them would accept it, because most of the senators in that party had slaves at home, and they didn't want them to snitch about it and let the other people know about it. You have to know that the majority of the people in ancient Rome didn't have slaves because they couldn't afford it. It wasn't something that was available to everybody. And the remaining 20% that had slaves didn't want normal people to know how many there are because it was an extremely ridiculous amount. If people knew exactly, there could be a cause of revolution. And this did happen once in 71 BC. A slave by the name of Spartacus gets an army of about 70,000 people to revolt against the Roman army. There's a movie about Spartacus, but unfortunately he's defeated by a general named Crassus, so his revolt didn't really work out. If you've seen our video about the battle at Carrhae, you know what happened when Crassus has taken over the entirety of Europe. He's building the Roman Empire and making it bigger, and he wants to go eastwards to get more wealth from the Persians. But General Surena is waiting for him and teaches him a lesson. Most of the Roman slaves came from northern Africa, and this happened around 300 BC when the Romans defeated the Carthaginians after the Punic Wars. The Carthaginians were the powerhouse in northern Africa, and their biggest rival was the Roman Empire, and they had plenty of wars. So they had a special hate for this part of the world. But alongside all the slaves, most of them were men, and they didn't prefer women slaves. The women slaves were used for lighter works. They were mostly looking for young men as slaves, men that could work long hours without giving up. But good-looking women were used in a harem type thing, or brothels, and they would sell them for money. These are the Romans that are fighting wars with the Persians on the east, and that's the Parthians or the Sasanians. But the interesting thing is, the empires around them, especially the Persians, didn't have slaves to the extent of the Roman Empire. The Persians would usually enslave the prisoners of war, but some Persian kings had special rules that they would enslave non-Zoroastrians. But the interesting part is, some of the Persian kings would be okay if you convert to Zoroastrian, and they would free you rather than enslave you. Philosophers would always complain about this slavery happening in the Roman Empire, but complaining about this could mean their life, because the higher-ups and the emperors weren't a fan of them talking about this. They didn't want the slaves to be free-thinking individuals. They were always afraid of having an educated, tough population. Even though the Roman Empire fell, but slavery never ended. It's actually still happening to this day. If you've seen our video about cobalt, you'll be familiar with modern slavery. Even though these employees get a little bit of money, but their condition and the amount of money they're getting is no different than a Roman slave 2,000 years ago. Or you could compare it to sulfur mines in Indonesia, another type of modern slavery. And if you would like to know more about these types of slaveries and sulfur itself, we have made a video about it if you'd like to see it.